It's inventive, informative, ingenious. RadioChelsea.com. Radio Chelsea.
Seán McCarthy here, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Irish journalist, music critic, author and broadcaster Joe Jackson to Radio Chelsea. How are you, Joe?
I'm very well, thank you.
Well, you're probably best known for your books and interviews, having worked for 20 years for Irish rock magazine Hot Press, 11 years for the Irish Times, and 10 years for the Sunday Independent. You've interviewed numerous world celebrities and public figures, way too many to list entirely, including Leonard Cohen, Johnny Cash, Rory Gallagher, Andrew Lloyd Webber, Paddy Maloney and the Chieftains, Jim Sheridan, Bono, Bob Geldof, Tori Amos, Randy Newman, Eartha Kitt, Neil Diamond, Mary Chapin Carpenter, Tony Bennett, Tom Jones, Gene Simmons, Gabriel Byrne and Richard Harris. And that's just to mention a few. It almost feels redundant, Joe, rattling off just a few names of the literally thousands.
Well, I got bored listening to that there.
But I have to ask you, Joe, before we can chat about your interview with Richard Harris, what drew you to journalism in the early days? What was the kick in it for you, if you will?
It's one of those childhood dreams. I saw a movie when I was about 8 years old called Deadline Midnight with Jack Webb in it. And William Conrad, the guy who then was in a detective series on the television, he gave a great speech about the importance of journalism and the importance of passing information on to people which they otherwise might not have gotten. And it was like a call to arms, even though I was only a child. So I went home and told my folks, when I grow up, I'm going to become a journalist. Sadly, I never grew up, but I did become a journalist.
And what was it like for you, Joe, to have such access to, great stars, especially during the 80s and 90s in Dublin when you were writing for Hot Press, which was on the top of its game at the time as a publication? It seemed like every time I picked up a copy of the Hot Press at one or another of the radio stations I was broadcasting on in Dublin at the time, there was your name, Joe Jackson, emblazoned across the front page, interviewing one music giant or another. How did it feel, Joe, to be the fellow who was, getting access to speak to these great music artists and film stars and political figures of the time? Was there any kick in it or glam in it for you at the time?
I got as much of a kick out of as you mentioned earlier, I'm also back with the Irish Times now, but the decade I spent doing a weekly music interviews for the Irish Times probably gave me the greatest kick of all, apart from the broadcasting, because you knew, because it was the Irish Times, you got access to somebody for every Friday across all genres of music, and it was particularly a time where country music was very hip, and to interview people like Dwight Yoakam and even Garth Brooks and all that, and Katie Lang, was all very exciting to me. And on the other side, the interviews you mentioned, probably the most exciting were the political interviews at the height of the Troubles. People from all sides of all political divides, doing them every 2 weeks. I think I did about 80 of those in-depth interviews, sometimes up to 12,000 words, Q&A, always Q&A format. They were very exciting, and you knew you were contributing, however peripherally, to the peace process in a way, to the evolution of the peace process.
Well, Joe, one of the great Irish actors you interviewed over the years was the Limerick-born actor Richard Harris, with whom you became quite familiar. Indeed, this very Christmas, your 2 one-hour radio documentaries based on your 30 hours of taped interviews, which you conducted with Richard Harris, will be broadcast on RTE1, first on the 29th of December between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m, and then on the following night, the 30th of December, again between 10 and 11. Your in-depth interview with Richard Harris will mark the end of the year that was in it for Limerick, the year's City of Culture. Give us a feel for your Richard Harris interviews, Joe. First of all, how did your interviews with him come about?
Well, I said earlier that I got the dream of becoming a journalist when I was 9 years old, but as I grew up, in my late teens, I wanted more to be a creative writer. So around 87, the time I interviewed Richard, I actually was Ireland's first writer in residence at a vocational school, and I'd spent a decade writing poetry, would-be plays, screenplays, all this stuff. And the reason I moved into journalism was to meet my heroes. So I had a wish list of, and you mentioned one of them, the first person I interviewed was one I sought, Leonard Cohen. And then I had a short list, and very, very soon afterwards I interviewed Richard Harris, whose work, particularly his music, plus of course his movies, And a lot of these people I tracked down, like Sam Phillips in Memphis, Tennessee. I would just go after them myself. They weren't necessarily commissions. So I tracked down Richard Harris to the Berkeley Court Hotel in Dublin on October 10th, 1987. That's the first time we met. And that was the first interview we did. And it was very fractious to begin with because he didn't like my style of probing questions at first. And he was kind of dismissing me, very sarcastic, very bullish, and bullying. But we got through that, and somehow magically halfway through, and I broadcast it, you heard just how much he was trying to intimidate me and shut me up. But then something magical happened, which I won't reveal. People would hear it on the radio. Everything turned around, and he said to me years later that our friendship began at a particular point in the first interview. Then he asked me to write a one-man show for him. Then about 2 years later, he asked me to replace Michael Feeney Callan as his official biographer. So a lot of the tapes come out of those processes.
It's interesting. I was just about to ask you how approachable you found Richard Harris to speak with, Joe, and if he was responsive and comfortable with all and any of your questions.
No, he definitely he hated my questions at first, and he called me a smart ass. But funnily enough, after the interview, which lasted 3.5 hours, he introduced me to Noel Pearson, and he said this, and I'll omit the expletive. He said, this little whatever knows more about me than I do. We just did a brilliant interview. He was cheeky at first, but that's okay. He reminds me of me. That's his ego. And that's what was great about it. And then we found out, as the years progressed, he would be at his most articulate when I got him angry. So I purposefully, very often, got him angry.
Now, those 30 hours of interviews, are they from different years, or were your...
Absolutely, yeah. They span the years from 87. Well, a lot of them, as I say, were done for a book. A lot of them were phone conversations. But the epic interviews would have been 87, 1990, and 2000, about a year and a half before he died.
And was there anything he wanted to talk about specifically, did you find? Or was he just all, keen to answer?
Whatever questions I said, once we got over the initial hurdle, it was like no holds barred. Whatever I wanted to ask him. And the deeper we went into an issue, be it films, be it his drinking, his love life, his return to theatre, the field, whatever we wanted to talk about, he assumed that I would have done my research, and I always came with a meticulously structured set of questions, and he very much engaged in the process.
Now, could you differentiate between the two, between the actor and the man relaxed later in years as he spoke to you more?
Well, that's what when I went in to meet him for the first time, I didn't want to talk to the actor. And that's what I told him, which is what got him angry before the tapes even started rolling. I said to him, I said something like, would it be fair to say that on TV interviews such as Jonathan Ross recently, you tend to use anecdotes as a ploy against self-revelation? Now that's thrown down the gauntlet to King Arthur. And that's what he didn't like, but in time he picked it up. So I was never interested in just talking with, and he was a man who believed in masks, who believed in presenting particular images, particularly to interviewers. So from the start I was laying down the gauntlet and saying, I'm not going to accept that, and don't be running away with anecdotes. And he loved that. He loved being challenged and provoked that way. So from about halfway through the first interview, it wasn't the actor I spoke to, it was Richard Harris, the man.
Now, one of my favourite songs of all time, Joe, happens to be MacArthur Park, which Richard Harris recorded, released in 1968, and which was written by another of your interviewees, Joe, the legendary songwriter Jimmy Webb, one of the most widely respected and recorded songwriters of all time. The likes of Linda Ronstadt, Art Garfunkel, The Supremes and Sinatra are just a few who have recorded Jimmy Webb songs. You interviewed Jimmy Webb, Joe, who spoke to you about his encounters with your own favourite singer of all time, Elvis, his deep-rooted love of Irish music and his friendship with Richard Harris. What did Jimmy Webb have to say about Richard's recording of his song, Joe, if anything? And also, what was it like for you to hear his first-hand stories about Elvis, whom you admired tremendously?
Well, Richard Harris also had his stories about Elvis, which not many people know. You know, he visited Elvis backstage in Las Vegas trying to impress some woman, he told me. And it was during that meeting that he said Elvis, number one, struck him as the loneliest man alive. And he also said that Elvis was very humble and said to Harris, you know, I watch all your movies, and reamed off things like A Man Called Horse or whatever it was. And then he said, would you mind if I record My Boy? And Harris said, it's not my song. You know, I'm sure I've no problem with that, but you'd have to ask the permission of the songwriters. So that's how Elvis came to record My Boy. Jim Webb was fascinating because, I mean, one of the reasons I loved Harris's music was because my father bought A Tramp Shining, which of course had MacArthur Park, and I bought The Art Went On Forever and all of the Webb songs. So it was fascinating for me to meet Jim Webb. But again, he had a fractious relationship with Richard Harris. And I think Richard and he fell in and out of their relationship. And Webb said to me at one point, now admittedly he was hungover from a night out in the town in Dublin, and I bumped into him in the Shelbourne Hotel, and he said to me, I hope I don't want to die not having made up with Richard. Now, I don't know if they did, but they had a difficult relationship, but it resulted in 2 astounding albums and some songs also on the My Boy album.
Incredible. Well, you've written some 13 books, Joe, all of which are available to order online, with a wide range of ebooks now selling in the iBook store on Apple, including your books Bono, Soul Searching and Uncensored, Bob Geldof, The Joe Jackson Interviews Plus, and David Norris, Trial by Media, to mention just a few of your 13 titles available. Tell me, Joe, it appears as if you are writing day and night these years, with so many books being published. How do you work as a writer? Do you write late into the night, or what kind of a schedule do you keep?
Well, I only stop writing when people call me to do phone interviews. No, I'm a ceaseless writer. You know, I normally, early in the day is my best time, so it would be 6:30 before the phone stopped ringing. If I can get 6 hours in, I'm happy. But I never stop. Then I have a laptop on me when I go out, if I'm out, and I'll be revising and continuing. And I'm particularly excited about the ebook phenomenon. You mentioned they're in the iBook stores, but they're also on Kindle, and they're for Kobo, and they're in Barnes & Noble. It's very exciting to be able to anthologize, you say, the Bob Geldof interviews or the Bono interviews, and for the first time give the backstory to all the interviews. Because when I did the interviews, I was just the guy asking the questions. I wasn't the kind of interviewer who liked to slap himself in the middle of the stage, in the middle of the page or the stage. So now I've got a chance to actually say, give a really deeper context for, we'd say, the Bob Geldof interviews. I grew up with Geldof out in Dundee. I knew him back when we were kids. So this adds a different dimension to interviews that people would have, maybe, like yourself, would have read in Hot Press of the Irish Times and the Sunday Independent.
And what is it about people's stories that intrigue you most, Joe? And do you think the art of storytelling is leaving us, what with all the, the instantaneous gratification we seem to crave these days on social media?
Yeah, well, I don't know that the art of storytelling is diminishing, but I think the art of interviewing is. A lot of the interviews I see are incredibly tedious, incredibly superficial, and they're basically promotional tools for somebody selling something. I always moved against that, and I always wanted to go for some kind of... I am fascinated listening to people's stories, and the deeper I can go into them, and I got my key, and I told her this, my key on interviewing from Dory Previn. When she once said about the album she wrote, or the solo album she did in the early 70s, that the deeper she reached into herself to write those songs, the more universal the story became. And I found, too, that the deeper I reached inside an interviewee to get them to tell their story, the more universal the story became. So, I've always found it fascinating. I still find it fascinating, and I'm a bit saddened by what seems to be the way the in-depth interview is kind of fading out of style.
Now, you've been through a turbulent time yourself these past 2 years, Joe, with the sad loss of your mother, Phyllis Jackson, on January the 9th, 2013, followed by a recent house move during which you moved back into the city of Dublin. A Mother's Love is a Blessing is your beautiful tribute to your mam, which you wrote. Tell me about your book about your mam, Joe. Obviously an important book for you to write.
Well, it was in a way I kind of regret. I think at the time I was a bit too open on Facebook and Twitter about what I was going through because, I'd never experienced the death of my mother before, or her ailment and illness for 18 months. It was an incredibly traumatic, heartbreaking, soul-breaking, spirit-sapping time. And I put together some of my articles, again, with a new backstory and a preface, and just put it out as a tribute to her. Also, the last present I gave her in her life on Christmas Day 2012 was a compilation book called Walk On With Hope in Your Heart, which there are some great reviews for it on Amazon, and I'm not praising myself via the reviews. The book was designed to help lift people's spirits. So the 15 people interviewed, there are 15 people I interviewed through the years: Tony Bennett, Neil Diamond, Joan Rivers, the late Joan Rivers. All their stories are stories that make you go, good God, I thought I had it bad until I read this. So the last book, and my mum and I designed the cover for that. She loved the picture. I gave that to her on Christmas Day. That was the real tribute to her. And then she died like 12 days later, whatever it was. So, I mean, in a way I'm sorry, and in a way I am considering perhaps withdrawing A Mother's Love is a Blessing and doing it properly. I think I just put it together very fast as an emotional reaction to the loss of my mother.
Do you think it was a way for you to heal a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know that. I think if that was my attempt, I did it wrong. I think I should have, I published it within weeks of her death, and the intro was written. It's incredibly raw. It contains the homily or eulogy I gave at her funeral. And, there's a part of me that goes, okay, that was part of the process, but now it's time to pull it back. But a lot of people love what I wrote about her because I seem to articulate what a lot of people feel for their mother, and maybe they aren't writers and maybe they can't say it in quite the same way I can. And if I'm serving that purpose, I'm very happy.
Well, I saw the expression of your love for your mam on Facebook, and really it strikes me as an expression of just how real you are.
Thank you. Well, also, if that's what it reflects, it also reflects how real she was. And how, the fact that she could generate this kind of lifelong love and admiration from me. I mean, before she died, I had interviewed so many people like Christy Moore or whoever who would speak so glowingly of a deceased parent. And I very often found myself thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful if Christy's mother or father or whoever could hear this? So 3 years before my mum died, though I never told her this is what I was doing, I wrote a tribute to her called A Song for My Mother in the Sunday Independent. And it was a celebration of her life and her spirit, and I wanted her to read it before she was gone. So, I mean, even that article is one of the articles of which I'm most proud.
Well, you certainly have suffered a great loss in your life, Joe, and I'm sure I speak for many of your Facebook friends when I say that we all got to know something about the deep love you have for your mam, which I respect and admire tremendously. Now, you've also been very active again, Joe, with your work, meeting with a potential producer and director for your one-man stage show, and you've even launched a website, joejacksonjournalist.com, where many of your books can be ordered, where we can read your blog. You've also got links up there to Facebook, Twitter and YouTube presences that you own. How important is your work to you, Joe, these days?
It's of pivotal importance. When I have no family left, my work was always of central importance to me, but when you become, someone called me a cosmic orphan, and I kind of understand the phrase. When you become a cosmic orphan and you don't have a family and you don't have children and you realize, geez, the only thing I may leave is my legacy, your work becomes even more important than maybe it was before. And that's part of the reason for me anthologizing them, for doing perhaps a stage show, for trying to get them onto radio. And there's talk of an Irish institution buying my entire archive to make them available for people in future generations. All of that is hugely important to me.
Well, I think the archive is a fantastic idea, and I want to thank you, Joe, for coming along and chatting with me here on Radio Chelsea. It's been a great honour having you on, and we planned it for a while, and finally we've had our chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Great stuff.
And we're very much looking forward to tuning into RTE1 for your Richard Harris Christmas special.
Thank you. Look, it was great fun talking to you, and I know we were meant to do this before, but perhaps this was the best time to do it. And I do thank you. You knocked me a little sideways by bringing up the subject of my mother. It's nice to have someone remember her out there.
Well, it's been a great pleasure to chat with you, Joe, and we wish you the very best of luck.
Same to you. Thank you very much.
And Joe, you're always welcome here on Radio Chelsea.
Good stuff. Thank you very much. We'll talk again.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Joe.
Bye.
Take care now. Bye-bye.
Radio Chelsea.
Radio Chelsea.